American Oligarchy, 5 Fights, Part 1. It's always darkest just before it goes totally pitch black. We're daily buffeted by bad news designed to scare and demoralize us. But what if that backfires? What if we don't cave? What if this current crisis is the only thing that could put us on the right path to a prosperous and equitable future? We are moved to amend. Grassroots citizens dedicated to passing a 28th Amendment to overturn Citizens United, the disastrous 2010 Supreme Court decision that made the Trump coup possible because it enshrined that corporations are people and money is speech. Before the Trump takeover, a 28th Amendment was a long-term goal, but now it's our only hope. We've done this 27 times in our history, the first 10 times being the Bill of Rights. In fact, we the people have beaten corporate attempts to take over America 5 separate times. Now we're in round 6, a real democracy crisis. The Chinese word for crisis is made up of 2 symbols, danger and opportunity. Clearly, we're at an inflection point. Something has to change. The good news is that big shocks can lead to rapid and positive change. But here's the danger part. It can also lead to fascism. The oligarchs can win, and indeed they are advancing all over the world. Think of Putin, Orban, Bukele, and others. Our present crisis is the product of systemic degradation that's been going on for decades. We can trace this degradation back to at least the 60s, when, remember, we had similar upheaval and polarization. We'll explore this in depth in the next episode, but briefly, future Supreme Court Justice Powell wrote a secret memo to protect corporations from 60s cultural critique and democratic accountability. This strategy merged with the Republican program for permanent minority rule, which they are close to achieving, thanks in no small part to the tsunami of dark money unleashed by that 2010 Citizens United ruling that established money is speech and corporations are people. So this gives us a big clue about what the root cause of our crisis is, namely corporate constitutional rights. But to understand the real story, we have to go all the way back to the founding of our democratic experiment, which will also give us some clues about how to move beyond our current crisis. This history will show that our democracy, as mentioned, has been threatened by corporate oligarchy 5 times, and we the people organized and prevailed. We can and must do that again now. Round 1. 1776 was our first fight with oligarchy. A fact that gets conveniently left out of the American history books is that America actually began with an act of massive, nonviolent, anti-corporate civil disobedience, the Boston Tea Party. Some quick background. In 1580, Sir Francis Drake sailed home to England with a rich cargo of spices and captured Spanish treasure. His main investor, Queen Elizabeth's half share of the cargo, surpassed the rest of her income for that entire year, a 5,000% return on her investment. So profitable was this piracy, they decided to scale it up. So they got more aristocratic investors and started the first modern corporation, the East India Company, in 1600. This allowed Elizabeth to do colonization on the cheap, via privatization. She empowered the East India Company to use any means, including raising a private army, to conquer lands and extract wealth. Years later, they botched the job so badly that the British government took over India, the Raj. However, before that, the East India Company was defeated militarily by its rival Dutch West India Company and went heavily into debt. But its investors, remember, the English aristocracy, saved it by granting it an exclusive monopoly to sell its only asset, a huge cache of tea to the American colonies. Anybody else besides the East India Company who imported tea was declared a smuggler. Kind of like now if you refuse to buy a Tesla, you're a terrorist. In the Boston Tea Party, enough for 1 million cups of tea was dumped into the harbor in protest, which the company said was worth $1,700,000 in today's money. When Boston patriots refused to pay for the tea, the Royal Navy enforced an economic blockade of the harbor. The rest you know. The colonists went to win the Revolutionary War and our freedom. The East India Company went on to be the biggest drug trafficker in history, producing the Opium Wars. The score at the end of the first round: corporate oligarchy 0, America 1. Now you might be wondering, given this history, if corporations are so important and dangerous, why aren't they in the Constitution? Fair question. But it's because the founders wanted to keep them a state matter so that local people could keep an eye on them. In addition, they were originally rare and limited, only getting a single task that the government couldn't easily do, like dig a canal. Moreover, they had a strict time limit, usually 10 years, and their charter could be revoked at any time for any reason, including just not doing a good job. This will change, as we will see. But you know what else isn't in the Constitution? The Supreme Court getting to decide what's constitutional. How did that happen? In 1800, after the conservative Federalist President John Adams lost to the more liberal Thomas Jefferson, he packed the court with hyper-partisan judges. On taking office, Jefferson found Adams' undelivered stack of judicial appointments and ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, to lose them. Based on the ensuing court case, Justice Marshall grabbed the right to overturn a law passed overwhelmingly by Congress and signed by President Washington himself. Not too many years later, the state of New Hampshire thought it would be a good idea if Dartmouth College was a secular state school, not a religious institution, and amended its charter accordingly. However, the Supreme Court stopped this, ruling that a corporation is an artificial, immortal being, and that New Hampshire had violated a contract. We will see this is the first of many times that the Supreme Court rules for property rights over people rights. We will also see that the Supreme Court will increase corporate constitutional rights while whittling away those of actual citizens. After that Dartmouth case, the Supreme Court, deciding what's lawful and constitutional, lay dormant for quite a while, until Justice Roger Taney tried and failed to deal with the slavery question in the much-reviled 1857 Dred Scott decision. The court ruled that because the slave Scott was considered private property of his owners, he was subject to the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, prohibiting the taking of property without due process. That Supreme Court decision has been widely denounced, both for its overt racism and for its crucial role in the start of the American Civil War 4 years later. Part 2. This Dred Scott Supreme Court failure brings us to Oligarchy versus America, Round 2. The Civil War. Slavery was seen as a negative even by many of the founders who held slaves, and most thought it would fade soon. But the cotton gin came along, which did the work of 50 people. So suddenly a slave like Dred Scott, who had been selling for $250, was suddenly worth $1,200. The Southern oligarchs did not merely want to secede and keep slavery in the southern part of the country. They actually wanted to make slavery the law of the land. Tom Hartman explains that there's basically a 5-step process for oligarchs to take over America, and we see a number of them in a speech by Illinois Representative Farnsworth in 1864. He noted that they tried to expel John Quincy Adams, got control of all three branches of government, of churches, of the high society, and then suppressed the right to petition, freedom of the press, and the mail. The Dred Scott decision, as well as the Southern oligarch sedition, was essentially overturned by the Civil War, at the cost of 600,000 casualties, but it led to the 13th through 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment is going to become really important here going forward, because it's been captured by corporations in order to get constitutional rights on top of their already powerful economic and legal capabilities, which gives them political power through legalized bribery. A recent example: billionaire tech lord Elon Musk basically buys the presidency. Then another set of oligarchs arose in the gilded, not golden, age of the corporate robber barons, a time like our own, when enormous wealth was concentrated. Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the like used their economic, legal, and political power to destroy or buy out their competition. And they tried to consolidate their power to the maximum by winning corporate constitutional rights. They were opposed by the populist Grange, that's the farmers, and the more urban labor movement, as well as the progressive movement. The progressives put safeguards in place so that they could beat the robber baron oligarchs if they captured the political system, as in fact they did, notably the Southern Pacific Railroad in California and the Copper Kings in Montana, and this will become important later on as well. At the same time, in the 1880s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly was threatened by an Ohio law, so it fled to New Jersey. This started what is called chartermongering, states making it easier and easier with fewer and fewer restrictions to have a corporation, which starts a kind of race to the bottom. That trend has continued, but the corporate oligarch's biggest and most consequential victory in this time period took place on the opposite coast, in the form of the 1886 Southern Pacific Railroad versus Santa Clara County court case. The Southern Pacific, which got big subsidies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and then tried to get out of repaying the loans by buying a Senate seat, controlled transportation in California and thus the economic and political system. To lock in their power, they kept trying to get corporate constitutional rights by sneaking it into every trivial and unrelated lawsuit, such as this Santa Clara case regarding, incredibly, 3 hogs that were run over, and a later case regarding property taxes on their fences. So badly did they want to win, they hired Senator Roscoe Conklin, who had turned down an appointment to be on the Supreme Court twice because it didn't pay enough. He in fact made quite a good living as a consultant in railroad legal cases because he was on the committee of, there it is again, the 14th Amendment, remember, which overcame Dred Scott by enshrining in the Constitution, the highest law in our land, that freed slaves have equal protection under the law. Sadly, it's rarely been used to protect African Americans, but has been used well over 200 times to protect corporations. So Conklin would wave around his journal and claim that it proved the committee intended to include artificial persons, that is, corporations. Remember, like Dartmouth? Not just natural persons with belly buttons. J.C. Bancroft Davis, former railroad president, wrote up the 1886 fence decision at the direction of Associate Justice Stevens J. Field, who was a pal of Leland Stanford, president of the Southern Pacific Railroad and, not coincidentally, governor of California. Field desperately wanted to be president of the United States, and he needed the railroads to back him. Thus he was upset in this fence property case that Bancroft Davis did not clearly establish corporate personhood. Bancroft merely dropped a few lines into the head note, which actually has no legal standing. He stated that the justices all agreed that corporations are in fact people, and thus entitled to constitutional protection like citizens. And that's how it happened. But all this flew under the radar for quite a while, and the progressives did rack up some important wins against corporate monopoly and the robber barons. For example, the ability to recall a governor and to write laws by proposition. We get Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, who went after the monopolies, and in 1907, the Tillman Act made it a felony for a corporation to give money to a federal campaign. There was a large fine, 2 years in jail, and it could lose its charter, essentially a corporate death sentence. But never fear. Corporations can always depend on the Supreme Court, which did its best to roll back those progressive-era gains. This time is often called the Lochner era, a term you might have heard recently in terms of the new Trump supermajority on the Supreme Court. In the Lochner era, the Supreme Court conservatives knocked down even the most benign progressive laws in the name of property and contracts, for example, child labor, or limiting the hours in the workday. So again, we see property being privileged over people. This originalist Supreme Court also blocked President Roosevelt's New Deal, ruling bills unconstitutional despite the fact that they had passed Congress overwhelmingly. Part 3. But at the same time, a bigger threat was brewing, which brings us to round 3 in our Oligarchy versus America fights. Remember that a crisis can lead to an important reform or fascism. The New Deal was fought not only by the Supreme Court, but also by corporations, especially the National Association of Manufacturers, DuPont and Rockefeller. Aligned with them was the Liberty League, and a lot of that America First nonsense that comes up with Reagan and later with Trump has its roots here. These corporations also supported the 1933 fascist business coup. This involved General Smedley Butler, a retired Marine Corps general twice awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He regretfully called himself a gangster for capitalism because he had fought unions and democracy, particularly in banana republics, as well as for Standard Oil in China. He was approached by businessman Gerald McGuire to arm veterans like the American Legion to storm and take the Capitol, probably because in 1932 Butler had been a big supporter of the Bonus Army, which had a very disciplined and peaceful protest encampment at the Capitol, busted up by the Army with tanks, gas, and bayonets. They were merely asking for money promised to them for their World War I service to be paid a few years early to get their families through the Great Depression. General Butler blew the whistle on this coup, and when McGuire was questioned by the House Un-American Activities Committee, it proved that this coup could have happened. The Liberty League's principal players were wealthy Americans and corporations, including the aforementioned DuPonts, J.P. Morgan, U.S. Steel, General Motors, Standard Oil, Chase National Bank, and Goodyear Tire. In fact, General Motors, IBM, and Texaco did business with the Nazis. After the coup was exposed, the congressional hearings about it were minimized by the press. But the good news is we defeated the Nazis at home and abroad, which led to post-war prosperity. Round 3 score, fascist oligarchs 0, we the people 3. Part 4. Round 4 is the 1980s Reagan era. We'll go more into this in Episode 2, an inconvenient sequel, but here's the highlights. After World War II, productivity and wages both go up together, partially because we're investing in ourselves. For example, the GI Bill for education, VA loans for buying homes, as well as investing in a lot of research and development. This was done by the government, but also by the corporations, because at this time there's a 90% tax bracket, So CEOs put money back into the business in terms of innovative research and development, but also wages. Not coincidentally, unions are also very strong in the post-war period, because in 1935, FDR had passed a law to protect them. So unions provide a kind of counterbalance to corporate power. But along with the prosperity came turmoil. The civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, gay liberation, American Indian movement, and Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers. Also during this period, there were the Vietnam protests, and corporations like Dow Chemical brought us horrendous weapons like Agent Orange and napalm. For the first time in a long time, maybe since the Progressive Era, what's good for General Motors is good for the USA was questioned. This paradigm shift terrifies one Lewis Powell, who was a corporate lawyer. His neighbor and pal was Eugene Sydnor, head of the Chamber of Commerce, now the biggest lobbyist in the United States, shoveling corporate secret money into our elections. Powell writes a secret memo for the Chamber to defend American corporations. His basic argument is the left has capabilities that the right lacks, so they need to leverage their resources, basically money, and build up what he claimed were balancing capabilities. For example, they're going to use their money to intimidate the press and the universities to send right-wing conservative messages about how great the free market is. The Powell memo is the blueprint for the right-wing infrastructure, better known now as the Coctopus, because it was immediately funded by some of America's greatest fortunes, including the Koch brothers, Richard Scaife, who was a Mellon, Joseph Coors, the DeVos family, and others. Those budgets paid for think tanks, AstroTurf front groups, and conservative media. We will see in the next episode that the fossil fuel corporations basically rented out this right-wing infrastructure in order to carry out their business model, which requires burning the planet for profit. Not only that, but it enables the systemic degradation that makes oligarchic coups possible, as we'll see. Nixon appoints Powell to the Supreme Court, where he steadily undermines campaign finance laws, which were put in place after the Watergate scandal exposed that Nixon was elected with the help of, you guessed it, secret corporate money. Powell and the Supreme Court start effectively overturning campaign finance law like the Tillman Act with the Bellotti and Buckley cases, which steadily gave corporations more ability to contribute to political campaigns, which in turn helps Ronald Reagan to win the White House. Powell's efforts eventually will lead to the 2010 Citizens United case, which unleashed the tsunami of dark money into our political system. Clearly, it's not an accident that weakening campaign finance laws are one of those 5 steps Tom Hartman has laid for a democracy to fall to fascism oligarchy. Step 1 is to get control of the media, academia, and we can add courts. Step 2 is weaken or evade campaign finance law. This makes it easier to accomplish Step 3, takeover of a political party. Then taking over the government is Step 4. Step 5 is to use the police or military to protect oligarchic power. See the study guide or bonus episodes for how these steps were used in rounds 4 through 6. Instead, let's quickly go through a checklist to see where we are and learn how far the coup has gone. Georgia Democratic leader and organizer Stacey Abrams crystallized our present danger in this wake-up call.
Over the weekend, you went viral for laying out 10 steps to autocracy. Run us through those steps so we all know.
Okay, so this happens in every nation that has become an autocracy, having been a democracy. So whether we're talking about Brazil with Bolsonaro, or India, or Putin and Russia, the Philippines with Duterte. So start with winning an election. Usually the last one you're going to get to have for real. Number 2, you have an expansion of executive power. The president decides he wants more than he's supposed to have. Number 3, you start to make the Congress complicit. So you weaken them and you neutralize or neuter the judiciary. Like, I don't know, the Supreme Court giving you unfettered power and saying we don't have the ability to stop things. Then you move on to firing all of the people who know how to make government work. Mm-hmm. So you gut the civil service. And you do that because you want to break democracy so people forget the stuff that used to get done. So you can't get your Social Security check. So the CDC doesn't know what diseases are anymore. Mm-hmm. Then you put in place these loyalists, these people who are only responsive to you. You put them in charge of the FBI so they go after your enemies. You put them in charge of the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, so they can signal to their friends and tell them all about the evil plans that you have. Then you make certain that you break how we communicate. So you criticize the media and you create your own echo chamber of propaganda. You call it truth even though you know you're lying. Then you go to the next step, and I call that step 7. Because at step 7, you have to blame someone. You have to blame people for the broken government, for the broken promises. So you go after DEI. You go after the vulnerable, the dispossessed. You go after any community that doesn't look like what you think power should be. While you're doing that, you make certain that in step 8, you eliminate anybody who can help them. So you sue law firms that do pro bono cases. You go after philanthropies and accuse them of giving money to the wrong people. You go after colleges and universities that can teach people possibly what else they should know. You get to step 9 and you start to encourage and incentivize private violence. You send the US Marines into spaces they should not be. You send the National Guard in. You kidnap people off of the streets and pretend that's normal, because that's how you quiet dissent, because you make everyone afraid that if they don't do what you want, they might be next. And once you've done those 9 steps, step 10 is easy. That's when you decide there won't be new elections, because everyone's either afraid, poor, broken, or complicit. We can fight back. We can remember that we do have power. They don't want dissent, so protest. They want us to forget that before we had power, we had each other. So when they break democracy, when they break the Social Security system, when they slash SNAP benefits and Medicaid, make sure you're checking on your neighbors. Make sure we're using mutual aid. But also tell the truth. Do not let the propaganda win. Too often they tell a lie. They will tell a lie so often it sounds like the truth. We say the truth one time, and when people don't applaud, we stop talking. We've got to keep telling the truth, not only to push back against them, but to remind us that we are entitled to the truth. We have to believe that freedom of assembly means it's more than just going to protest. It's the ability to be friends with people who aren't like you. And we have to stop believing that we are in this alone. The most effective thing they do is isolate us. They convince us that you and I don't have any common cause, and we certainly don't have common cause with someone who has a different history than we do. When we hold to our truth, when we actually believe in ourselves and our people, when we believe in democracy as something that must deliver, that's when we start to fight back. And that's when they lose, because they win when we are too numb or too afraid to act.
Rachel Maddow recently insightfully summed up where we are and what we need to do.
Narrow or widen the aperture as much as you want. You can look at the very big picture or the small local picture anywhere in the country. And we try to do as much of both of those things as we can every week here on this show. But whether you're looking at small-scale local stories or the biggest picture stories about what's happening in our country, the story is the same. And it is now an undeniable thing. We have crossed a line. We are in a place we did not want to be, but we are there. The thing we were all warning about for the last few years is not coming, it is here. We are in it. This is what it likes, it turns out. This is what it's like, right? It's August, it's a Monday, every day the sun rises and the sun sets, and there are, sports and movies, and there are new hit songs, there are scandals here and there are crimes. There's everybody's personal quotient of family drama and health worries and money worries and falling in and out of love and in and out of faith. Life has not stopped, and none of our personal lives have stopped. But also, at the same time, life in the United States is profoundly changing, is profoundly different than it was even 6 months ago. Because we do now live in a country that has an authoritarian leader in charge. We have a consolidating dictatorship in our country. And it sounds melodramatic to say it, I know. But just go with that for a minute, right? Think in melodramatic terms. Think in cinematic terms. Imagine the cartoon-level caricature of what you think a dictatorship looks like. I mean, it's secret police, right? A massive, anonymous, unbadged, literally masked, totally unaccountable internal police force that apparently has infinite funding, but no identifiable leadership. And they act in ways designed to instill maximum fear and use maximum force. I mean, when you imagine an authoritarian country, right, what you imagine is masked secret police breaking people's car windows and snatching people off the streets and out of church parking lots and courtroom hallways and taking them away with no charges, no notice, no paperwork, no explanation, not letting them see lawyers, and then moving them secretly to what are effectively black site prisons, where they won't tell you who's there and where no one's allowed in to see what's going on. Right? And that kind of a cartoon caricature of an authoritarian country, the one you might have imagined in melodramatic and cinematic terms ever before we got here, you would expect, right, that you'd have a scapegoated minority group blamed for all things. In our case, immigrants. Right? And the new extraordinary powers and shows of force by the secret police, among other things, all these extraordinary powers and shows of force will be framed as necessary to stop this terrible internal enemy. Right? Frame everything as immigration enforcement. Because for immigration enforcement, not only is all force justified, but maximum force is preferred. And they're trying to make it into a national entertainment to threaten to feed immigrants to alligators in South Florida. Right? They're making them eat off dishes on the floor like they're dogs. The Crumb Detention Center in Florida. They want us to like that, right? The Republican Party wants to sell T-shirts about that. And if you think it's only about immigrants, take the president's own word for it when he says the homegrowns are next. And then he starts musing publicly about which Americans he intends to strip of their citizenship. I mean, in a cartoon caricature of an authoritarian country, displays of military might are not just for the country's external enemies. They're for the country's own people, right? Because in an authoritarian country, you turn military force inward toward the people of that country. Both The Intercept and The New Republic in the last couple of days have had new reporting about Trump administration plans to permanently integrate the active duty U.S. military into, of course, immigration enforcement. So we will have our own U.S. military troops mobilized on U.S. soil, U.S. military force turn inward on us in an ongoing and permanent way. For immigration enforcement, right? And, like they tried in L.A., to put down protests against the government. Because those protests relate to immigration enforcement. What else do you think of when you think of authoritarian countries? I mean, in the worst case, you think of death camps. We don't have those. What we do have are black site prison camps, including huge new ones that are designed to hold thousands of people. The biggest ones we've yet had have just been bidded out to contractors for construction, and they're building them now on U.S. military bases. And they say they want states to build them all over the country. In the cartoon caricature of an authoritarian state, there's secret police, there's prison camps, there's the scapegoated enemy on whom all things must be blamed and against whom all things are justified. Protests must be criminalized. Media must be intimidated into saying and doing what the leader wants, or they must be shut down, or both. Universities must be intimidated into saying and doing what the leader wants, or they must be shut down, or both. Law firms must be intimidated into not opposing him and saying and doing what he wants, or they must be shut down. And for institutions like that, it's not just the boldest or most strident critics of the president who must be shut down. It's the most mainstream, right? It's the most prestigious, the most credible, because that's what's so dangerous about them. There can't be any source of authority. There can't be any source of authoritative statements of fact that compete with what the leader insists must be the new truth. And so government departments will be stripped of their experts, and he will fire his way through them until they tell him things that he wants to be told. If you want to be a 4-star general or admiral in this military, you must now pass a personal one-on-one interview with the president, who personally will decide if you are to his liking or not. to be a flag officer in this military. The intelligence agencies will say that his strike on Iran obliterated their nuclear program because he likes that word, obliterated, and he said it once. And therefore, because he said it, it must be true. And if you say otherwise, you will be fired. The Justice Department will say that the president won not just the last election, but he also won the one before that, the one he actually lost. And anybody who points out that Russia tried to help him win the one before that should be criminally charged for saying that, even though it's true. We are not heading towards something like this. We are there. It is here. It is the environment in which we are now living. And so, given that you now live in a country with an authoritarian leader, the question is, what can you do for your country? The question is no longer how to prepare for this risk or how to try to avert it, but rather how to fight it now that it is here and in effect. And, you know, we're awake now. It's clear. We're all living here. It's very obvious that this is not going to get better on its own. This is not going to fix itself. An authoritarian just seeks more and more and more power throughout not just politics, but through all of society, systematically trying to eliminate any effective means of opposing him. This is a one-way ratchet if we leave it up to him. But that at least does give us some clarity for Americans who do not want to leave it up to him. Right? We're beyond waiting and seeing now. It is clear what is going on. It is clear now that these small d democratic tools that we've got right now as a country, these are as good as it is going to get. We are never going to have more resources to fight for our country than we do right now. And so Americans are using those tools, and it is worth paying attention to the ways they are doing it. They are filming the secret police and publicizing everything they are doing. Even when the secret police scream and threaten and say, you're not allowed to film us, they are filming them. They are following them everywhere they go. They are not letting them have the power of surprise. They are refusing to be afraid to watch them and record them and show what they are doing. We have opposition politicians, Democratic politicians, insisting on being let in, going to the black site immigration prisons and demanding to be let into them. We have Americans protesting outside those facilities and showing up and calling the media and pulling every string they can when someone they know or someone they know of gets taken. Americans are making it as sticky and annoying and awkward and embarrassing as possible for these guys, and that slows them down. Americans are badgering elected Republicans everywhere they're willing to show their faces, including tonight in Nebraska, Republican Congressman Mike Flood holding a town hall with his red state constituents. Watch.
My question is fiscal. With $450 million FEMA dollars being reallocated to open Alligator Alcatraz and $600 million taxpayer FEMA dollars being used to now open more concentration camps and ICE burning through $8.4 million a day to illegally detain people, how much does it cost for fascism? How much do the taxpayers have to pay for a fascist country?
That was in Nebraska tonight at a town hall held by Republican Congressman Mike Flood, him hearing from his constituents tonight. We have total clarity now on what Trump's intentions are for the country. But I mean it when I say we. The country gets it and is more against it than they've ever been. And opposing this administration and what Trump is trying to do is turning out to be the story of the century.
So now you know how we got here and what is at stake, and that we've been here before and won every time. It all comes down to you, to us. It's unclear if in round 6 the oligarchs and fascists will finally win for the first time in 2.5 centuries. Despite the only real legislative accomplishment of the first and probably second Trump term being a massive tax cut for billionaires and corporations, McConnell did also manage to cram a lot of right-wing judges into our courts. Happily, Trump has routinely lost even before these hand-picked judges. However, It is becoming clear that while the courts can provide a holding action, it will be up to the American people in the streets making it clear we will not be ruled by kings or fascists. We must be persistent, resilient, and unrelenting. Talk to and work with your friends and neighbors. It almost does not matter on what. Planting a tree, cleaning up a creek or abandoned lot, delivering a meal to an elder, action, especially with others, reduces the paralyzing fear or despair that fascism depends on. Show up for town halls and rallies. See indivisible.org. Call and write your representatives, even if they seem on board or hostile, or even if not responding. Every call gets counted. If they get a dozen calls in one day on a topic, it's guaranteed that will be reported to the Chief of Staff. But in addition to our current actions, we have to keep our eyes on the prize. In the next episode, we'll see deeper into the Powell Memo, which led to the right-wing infrastructure, as well as the systemic degradation, like Citizens United, that made our current crisis possible. That in turn will provide the basis for what needs to be done to ensure it never happens again. A 28th Amendment that firmly and clearly enshrines once and for all that corporations are not people and money is not speech. Join us.
There's a fear that's made to keep us in our place, to pacify our anger and justify our full disgrace. There's a fear made to destroy and to degrade, but now we see shining light. Oh, and we are not afraid. But when the people speak, it's not with corporate lies. It's not with indecision or academic woes and ties. When the people speak, it thunders through these hills. It's not a thing, it's mild and meek. When the people